All right, so we talked about immigration and urbanization in the last lesson, and I'm going to talk to you today about the success of the middle class and Victorian morality. So let's jump right into this lesson. I'm Dr. Chris Erskine, and we're going to walk through this today, and then we're going to move on to the next chapter, and we're about just over halfway through this course. So you're plugging right along, you're doing really good. All right, so Victorian morality. Well, first of all, what does Victorian mean? Well, it's named after the Queen of England. And what's morality? Morality means doing something that's good. And so Victorian morality is doing things that people determined were good when Queen Victoria was on the throne. That's probably not a very good explanation. And that's Victorian morality is something that you should look up on the internet and learn more about that. That's English history, and we want to talk about kind of the impact of Victorian morality in the United States. Queen Victoria in the 1800s, late 1800s, and part of that was that you should be wealthy, and if you're wealthy, and there's a couple of other ideas that go in here with Victorian morality. We're going to explore some of those. But success of the middle class, they were successful. The middle class, the people that have not poor but not rich, but the people in the middle, and they're successful because they have good morals. That's what the belief was. Now, we don't believe that today. We believe that poor people can also have good morals. We believe that rich people can also have good morals. And we believe that people in the middle can also have good morals. But people in the middle can also have bad morals, just like people in the poor and people in the rich classes. But this is where we were at in the 1870s and 80s and 1890s, and that women should lead the men in this moral improvement because women had the ability to be better people than the men did. That was the belief back then. And that men should just control themselves because men just lacked self-control and they just needed to work on controlling themselves. So there's this idea of social Darwinism, and this is talked about in your textbook, but it's the first time we've talked about it here. Now, Darwin is a scientist, and he believed that he came up with the idea of evolution. And I'm not sure he came up with the idea, but he made it popular, and he had people that influenced how he thought. But it was Darwin's writings that made people believe in evolution. And evolution is that things change, and this notion of survival of the fittest, which means that if you're stronger, you will defeat the people who are weaker. And so if we apply this to socialism, social ideas, that means that people who are rich and who are middle class are better people than people that are the poor. Now, today we don't believe that in the United States. This idea of social Darwinism is gone. But there was this idea that if you were successful, if you were middle class, then it's because you were a good person. It's because God had blessed you, and because you were stronger than the people that were poor. And so there was this idea that God had somehow smiled upon you and blessed you and made you successful. But again, we don't accept this anymore. On the next slide, we see social leagues. Now, there were city vigilance leagues. It means you pay attention to what's happening in the city. And they fought prostitution, they fought gambling, they fought saloons. And because most people went to church on Sunday, they did not want any alcohol to be sold on Sundays. There was also the YMCA, which sent missionaries all around the world, including to China. There was the Red Cross, and I think you probably know about the Red Cross and the YMCA. There was one called the League for Decency, which meant a group of people that wanted to make sure that people behaved well. And the Women's Christian Temperance League means a group of Christian women who believed that people should not drink or smoke or gamble. So all kinds of social leagues were out there. But at the same time, there were more forms of entertainment that were keeping people busy. And on the next slide, we see some of those. Now, you'll see two pictures here. One of them, it looks like they're going super fast, and the man's hat is flying off, and he's on a roller coaster. And this is, of course, a drawing. It's not an actual photo. But the idea is that it's going so fast. Actually, it's only going about 6 kilometers an hour. It's going very, very slow. Today, it would be very boring. But people lined up to go to this roller coaster, as it was called. And on this bottom picture, it's an actual photo. And this is the first roller coaster in the United States. It was Coney Island in New York. These are called amusement parks. And so sports was also gaining a lot of popularity. People would go to the theater, not to see movies, but to see plays. Cinema, the movies came later, after 1900. They would go to dance halls. They go listen to music, like Scott Joplin. And they would ride bicycles. Now, bicycles. On the next slide, we see an early bicycle, and it looks a lot like today's bicycle. The handlebars are dropped down a little bit farther, and the seat looks a lot wider, but basically it's the same kind of machine as we have today. On the next slide, we can see the price of bicycles, $100 in the 1890s. $100 then would be $2,600. So there's only a few people around today that would pay $2,600 to ride a bicycle, and those people ride their bikes quite a lot. But in the 1890s, there were 2 million bikes sold. The Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur Wright, were brothers. They're from Ohio, and they moved to North Carolina to build an airplane, but they were bike makers. And Orville and Wilbur Wright were the first people to ever build and fly an airplane. And then there were a group of people called suffragettes, and suffragettes were women, and they wanted to be able to vote. And they rode bicycles. There were bike paths created. There were clubs, bicycling clubs. There were meetings for people who liked to ride bikes. This is one of the social clubs. There were outings where they would go riding bikes together. They would have uniforms. They would have these huge, massive outdoor weekend outings. And if you rode a bike, you were called a wheelman because of the wheel on the bicycle. And they had a great bicycle exposition where they would show off all kinds of bicycles. And they brought people from all around the world to this bicycle exposition. And it was in 1896 in Madison Square Garden, today, where a basketball team plays in Madison Square Garden in New York City, and or used to. And a Chinaman, and this is a quote from an advertisement, a Chinaman presides on the platform of a wheel, known by its yellow frame, a bicycle. An Indian with his war paint on, a swell, a giant Negro, a dime museum midget, a quartet of Jubilee singers, a fat boy, young men in racing costume, allegorical figures that suggest the names of standard wheels, and a rambling tramp. And even today, American students don't know what all of that means. And you don't need to know what it means either. But the idea is that they have all kinds of really great spectacles that you can come and watch and see, but with the bicycles. Now, on the next slide, we see this question, moral corruption. How could a bicycle be morally corrupt? It's a bicycle. And one historian named Irving Leonard writes this. He says, the bikes were a general intoxication, like alcohol, an eruption of exuberance, meaning just an explosion of happiness, like a seismic, like an earthquake, tremor that shook the economic and social foundations of society and rattled the windows of its moral outlook. Well, that's strong words. That's really strong words. Look at the next slide. How can this bicycle be morally corrupt? Well, it's like this. Notice what the women are wearing. They're wearing dresses. Women in those days wore dresses. That's what they wore. They do not wear pants. Look at the next slide. Women here have pantaloons. We call them pants today, but they call them pantaloons. And women are wearing pants instead of dresses. And so a lot of people believe that bicycles were morally corrupt because it was making women dress like men. And that was not okay. And so you would see a woman riding a bike. And if you see a woman riding a bike in a dress, you knew she was just a normal woman riding a bicycle. If you saw a woman riding a bike in her pantaloons, you knew that she was morally corrupt, or you believed it. And you also knew that she wanted to be able to vote in government. And that was something that women could not vote in America at this point. The next slide, you also see a woman on a bicycle. Very popular bicycles. And the next slide, and this is a slide that we've seen in the last lesson, but I want to mention this slide again because it's worth mentioning twice. Social leagues were so much a part of American life in the 1880s, 90s, and even the 1910s that America would be a different place today without them. You have city vigilance leagues that fight prostitution, they fight gambling, they fight saloons, and they don't want any alcohol to be sold on Sunday. There was the YMCA where you would go and exercise, and the YMCA created the first swimming pools that were swimming lessons in swimming pools that were for summer camps. They created summer camps. They created the idea of bodybuilding with weights, and the first basketball ever played was played in YMCA. They created there were social leagues for the Red Cross, the League of Decency to get people to behave well, and the Women's Christian Temperance League. And so there was a lot happening in the United States in the 1880s, 90s, and 1900s, early 1900s. Urbanization, social leagues, just so much was taking place. And so we're going to talk more about some of these issues and some more exciting stuff in the next chapter. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.